People seem to forget, if you change today, today will change your life. Hi, Paul. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Excellent. Very good. Thank you very much, Paul. Well, thank you for your time. And really, just most importantly, first, is how you're doing during this really, really crazy time and during this pandemic. How's it going for you?
I really can't complain. I think a lot of people are harder hit than we are.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen an increase actually in an inbound lead generation. One of the things our company does help with supply chain automation and saves people a lot of time in the manufacturing and engineering world. So it's been I don't want to say it's going to be good for business because obviously
Of course.
it's not good for
Yes.
anyone. But
Yes. Yeah.
but it's in that sense we're lucky.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I'm glad to hear. And you're right. It's always a choice of phrasing, isn't it? Because I have more people coming my way, but it's through tough times, it's great that you can provide a service for people. I think that's just a fantastic thing. Whenever the world is in a difficult situation, if you can provide a service that makes lives easier, then that's a fantastic thing. So, Paul, for those of you, for the people who won't be familiar, can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself? I've obviously done know plenty about you by this point, but for people listening, just a bit more about what you do.
Sure. About myself personally or about the
Yeah,
company?
please give us a bit of both, if that's all right.
Okay, sure. I'll try to be brief, but brevity is not my strongest suit.
Okay, take your
Um,
time.
I was born and grew up in the U.S. in Cincinnati, Ohio, on the west side, and was homeschooled from a very early age. And that meant I got to focus on things that I really liked. So means that I also skipped a lot of stuff. So very confused on American history every now and then, and English literature because I skipped it as a kid. But I got to really focus on science and math and things that I loved. So I got to take college chemistry at 12. I got to go to Harvard for astrophysics at 16. It was really cool. I got to really focus on things that I liked focusing on. And my goal from the beginning of my life was just to leave a big positive footprint on the world. The biggest footprint I can leave and point it in the right direction. In human progress. And so for me, doing that was either through science or technology. And around the time that I was really doing a lot of deep diving in this, I realized it's actually it's a combination of both. You need science is the knowledge that empowers technology, but you need technology to actually get utilization out of science. So I decided that the best way for me to contribute would be through a really high-tech startup that is not just like an app, but something that would create real tangible value for entire industries. And I decided that I still wanted to get a degree, a college degree. But I thought astrophysics didn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. So I thought, what would make a lot of sense would be German law. I'm kidding. It wasn't that obvious, but I got to go on an exchange year while I was there, and over to Switzerland. I learned Swiss German, which is close enough. And then I learned the language well enough, and I got into the university over there, and went to Heidelberg University in Germany, which is like their equivalent of Harvard. It's really good for law, and it's a really cool place. And I decided, look, this would actually be a better training for business and entrepreneurship, I think, than staying in the sciences would. So I decided to go forward with that. I was also tempted by the fact that I was told, and I don't know if this is true, but I was told several times over there that if you actually passed the bar here, you'd be the first American citizen born and raised in the U.S. who to move to Germany and pass this bar.
Oh, right, okay.
Very different language and everything. So that was kind of cool, and I thought that might actually give me an edge. I might be able to get a job somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so I took that. It was probably either the best or the worst decision I've ever made in my life. I can't decide. Loved every moment of it. I did pass. I did very well, but man, was it hard. They have a really high fail-out rate, and there's a reason no one ever did it before. I believe it. It's really, it might be, it's a very foolish decision in some ways because your odds are very low. But anyway, so did that and worked at a law firm very briefly. I funded this whole thing through startups ever since I was 16. I've always had a startup of some sort, self-employed, and and hired other people out to help me build technology. And after law school, especially considering I focused on IP law, it's about the closest you get to technology and law. It really, I noticed there was a really big problem, which was we could find digital assets of companies, like someone was stealing your logo or a video or music or whatever. But as soon as it was three-dimensional, when it came to like patent lawsuits, it was always after the fact. It was never it was always reactive versus preventative. And so I realized that, there's a lacking technology there. So I looked into three-dimensional search capabilities and three-dimensional analysis, and found a couple things that said that they did it. And I moved back to the US, started up this company called FISNA, which is short for physical DNA. And the very first thing I did, the company didn't have a name, it wasn't even a company yet, but I found my co-founder, Glenn Warner, who unfortunately passed away a few years later. But he and I took on this problem. We looked at every software in the industry, really wanting to use somebody else's technology to kind of solve more specific problems. We weren't looking to build something fundamental at the start, but everything just was really inadequate for what we were looking. I mean, you couldn't find parts within parts. If you cut a part in half, we didn't understand it anymore. The processing speed was terrible. The accuracy was even worse, and it was just like, man, nothing was working. So we thought, okay, it's not viable. We either need to build our own technology or give up on this idea. And we thought, I already just moved continents, so I might as well give it a shot. And poured everything I had into that. We went into a lot of personal debt, and for the first time in my life, and it took about 9 months for a whole team of coders to come up with something that actually worked. And it's based off of, actually, ironically, of all things, astrophysics was the inspiration for the algorithm that we built. And essentially what FISNA does is it's short for physical DNA, like I mentioned, and it codifies three-dimensional data regardless of the file type, regardless of where it comes from, regardless of how it's expressed and its viewer. It normalizes that, and it codifies it in a way so that the three-dimensional real world that we live in makes sense to the two-dimensional world of data and software.
Mm-hmm.
And so that it really, by bridging the gap between reality and the digital world, it's really cool because it opens up so many different use cases and so much technological opportunities. And at the time, I didn't realize that. I just thought we were solving an IP law problem. So we went to a couple of conferences, and we were telling people like, "Hey, I can catch people who are trying to steal your stuff for you." And they were like, "How?" And we explained the technology behind it. They were like, "Well, why do you even care about that? We got so many other things we can do with that technology. Oh my God, you could like triple our engineering speed. You could help automate procurement and supply chains. You could help with field workers. You could make a maintenance expert out of any person because we can show them how exactly these parts go together, different component options." And so we realized there was a lot of different things we could do with the technology. So we decided to start building them out, and skip forward a couple of years, and that's where we are today. We've been validated as best in class. If we've been business class for this, so that we're definitely by far the best. We were validated for that by government agencies, by large Fortune, top Fortune companies, and time and again against everything else in the industry. And it's really exciting because we're heading into a really open field, and we've been able to see the impact of our software now. It's not just the cool tech; it's actually, saving people's money for sure, time definitely, but also in some cases lives, because they're not making the same mistakes they would make in engineering. They're not buying the wrong parts, and they're identifying crucial alternatives for replacements.
It's incredible, and just for people, you've touched on a few very specific examples there, but just in terms of just talking even more in terms of how it's transforming the engineering world, can you just give us and the people listening like an idea in terms of scale and in terms of like actual speed and any way that we can quantify it in our heads in terms of how a radical difference this really does make?
A good analogy would be like, think of how long it takes for a Google search to show up, right?
Yeah.
It's immediate. And the same is true for a search in 3D. And that's a really big change from what was possible in the past. The other thing about the reason I also like using Google as an analogy is because, well, first of all, everyone understands it. But think about it like this. If you're looking for text, Google is great, right? Because they can find all the texts out there and whatnot. But if you're looking for, and 2D images, it does a pretty good job with that too. But when you're talking about three-dimensional data, it's a totally different language. You can't analyze it as text. You can't analyze it as 2D. And with machine learning, we can predict the text that makes sense for that. We can predict attributes about it. We can match 2D to 3D, but and vice versa. But when it comes to finding 3D data, what people have been doing in the past is they've been saying, okay, I've got a three-dimensional model of whatever, an engine, let's say, and they have to type in the word engine. But if somebody over in, you'd say, a different country was working on that engine too, they'll call it something else, right? And if you acquired another company and their models are called something totally different. And in reality, they don't call anything engine. They have these long, complex part numbers, and no one knows them, right? No one memorizes these part numbers. So what happens is people design the same things over and over and over and over again, which is a problem for a lot of reasons. One, it's time consuming, expensive for the engineers. They're not innovating, they're just redoing things from scratch. Secondly, it's a problem because all those new parts they're designing, they end up having, what happens is in supply chain, people order all those duplicate parts. Without realizing that they're all the same thing because they have different part numbers. And so they're ordering, like, if you might have 500 types of bolts for different things that you need to build, they're ordering 500 individual orders from 500 different vendors versus one giant order from the best price vendor. So that's a huge problem. And then when it comes to maintenance and repair, or even just like inventory management, people will actually say, oh, I need to place an emergency order for this bolt that we ran out of because otherwise our machines are shut down or we can't take off the airplane or whatever your use case is. And so things don't happen. Entire companies go down for days or weeks or whatever while we wait for a part to come in. But in reality, what we're finding is that often they've got 499 spares. In this hypothetical example, they're just called different things, right?
Right.
So that's the issue. And it's actually, what's fascinating to me is that in terms of numbers, like you asked for, software engineers, most people, most studies that you read show that software engineers are about 5 times as productive as mechanical engineers. And it's not because they're 5 times smarter, or it's because they have tools that they take for granted, like copy paste or search,
Sure.
or what's the difference between this code and that code, or where was this code snippet used. They don't have that in CAD or in any 3D application unless they manually tag it themselves, and everybody tags it the exact same way, which doesn't happen. So that all leads to a very significant slowdown, and it's actually I think a growing number of people think that's one of the reasons why, if you watch like Back to the Future and you look at what they predicted the future would look like, they were totally underestimated how far software would come along. Right. But they totally overestimated how far we would make it in physical gadgetry.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's just, it's harder to innovate a physical good than it is a digital one, and we're trying to make that the same and easier.
Okay. And for something that's such an exceptionally technical product, and heavily dependent on clever programming and machine learning and all of that stuff, you have to have assembled a pretty smart team around you. And it's when I hear this sort of kind of innovation and everything else, you just think of who are the people that are involved. And so for many people who are listening, who might be with their own businesses or leaders or CEOs or founder or whatever, assembling the right people around you is so incredibly important. So there's this amazing work that you're doing. And I'm just curious as to how do you make sure that you get the right people around you? And, how do you know if what they're telling you is right? Because, you've got your expertise, but obviously you are also reliant and codependent on bringing the best in class to come work with you to give you insights that maybe you or others can't see as well. So how do you find that right blend? How do you find that right team?
Oh man, I wish that I had a really short, simple answer for that. But the truth of the matter is that, as CEO, my goal is to eventually become the dumbest person in the company.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, I know what you mean.
I'm becoming dumber over time, but because I'm bringing in smarter and smarter people.
Yeah.
Right? So my goal is always to find people who are more talented than I do. And you're right. When it comes to highly specialized technical areas, I'm not completely technically illiterate, but absolutely we get into areas that I just don't understand as well as they do. Or if I did, then I'd be doing something wrong on my end, right? I need to hire smarter people. So what you have to do, and I've learned this the hard way. I've made very bad hiring decisions in the past, not just with them before it. I've learned a lot from them. You have to hire someone who you can validate as being very, very good based on what they've done in the past. Like hire someone who really is best in class. Hire someone who's a world renowned, or just has an amazing reputation, and someone who's validated their abilities, not just over a phone interview or physical interview with you, but based on the references on their past experiences, the work that they've done, so that you can get one solid person you can really, really trust for a given area. So in this case, let's say for machine learning, for just technology in general, right? And then rely on them, to be that person that figures out when other people apply for other roles, right? Are they telling the truth? Are they, making something up? Are they actually this good? And that's how you grow, right? Is by relying on a couple of really, really good people in a couple of really good areas that you can independently verify and validate, and then trust and leading on them. You're totally right, though. I would never have been able to build all this on my own. Even if I multiplied myself, I don't have the technical skill set, right, to do it. And hiring people is a big challenge. It's something that you have to accept that you'll probably get wrong occasionally. Some people are really good at interviewing. They're not that great when they actually get to work. You learn that from mean, honestly, I feel like most of what I've learned about hiring people is it's almost like a psychological level, right? It's I can talk to somebody for half an hour if I'm looking for this information. I can figure out what their motives likely are, if they're likely telling me the truth about something, what they really want out of a job. If are they job motivated, career motivated, calling motivated? Um, how passionate are they about this area, and then I get it about and I have another person who has more technical experience than I do validate that they have the skill set that's needed, and between those two assessments you can make some really good hires. We've hired some really amazing people here in just the past 2 months. Even with everything that's going on with coronavirus, we're still hiring, and we've hired really world-class talent here just recently. It's amazing some people we've able to attract.
Okay. And with in terms of like any business, you're always working on the business of today, and you're also working on the business of tomorrow or the business of the future. You've got to do both simultaneously. Just to get an understanding of your business, will the work that you do at some point, or maybe it does now, transform transform the world for non-engineers, like the
Yeah.
majority of us day to day? And I'd love to know what that looks like in your headspace today and going on in the future.
I'm so glad that you asked the question. That's a really, really good question. And that's something that I really want to touch on. So you're totally right. And if you allow me to do another analogy, if you go
Please,
back
yeah.
to 1980, right, and you were to look around 1980 and ask how many people know how to code software, very, very, very few. But at the same time, how many people were accessing and dealing with software? Very few, right? Or just only in a professional setting, right? You didn't have apps on your phone or anything like that. Skip forward to today, and there again, coding is extremely popular. Millions of Americans know how to code and code daily, and you also have so much access to it. It's on your phone, and what precipitated the growth of interest in coding was the exposure to more software. And it wasn't just computer software, it was apps, right? It's something that everyone dealt with on a day-to-day basis, part of their daily lives. And it inspired people to code more. And you can see there's this huge bell curve, this exponential growth in coders after the iPhone, the smartphone came out. Many more people were interested in coding after that than before. And so what you need is you need a sort of like a technological, or I guess you could say almost like a market-based driver of interest. And at the same time, you need an enabling technology. So there was a driver in interest because of the smartphone. That was the mechanical thing that made people interested in coding. And then there was a driver in interest as a result of that because it was affecting their daily lives. We're going to have we are having the exact same thing happen in 3D, and it's happening a lot faster than people think. The problem is that to release something in 3D, like AR, VR, mixed reality, augmented reality, virtual reality, 3D printing, these are technologies where it takes a while to get over a certain hurdle, and then magically, boom, you hit it. Just like the iPhone, right? We didn't have a sort of iPhone and then an iPhone. We had Nokia, brick, maybe a flip phone in there, and then bam, you got an iPhone, right? And so the same thing's happening in the other space too, where we've been struggling for a while. Google Glass tried to come out, didn't really work, but Apple's working on that now, and everyone's working on their own version of that. At some point, we will have, whether it's glasses or something else, augmented reality will play a bigger part in our lives. Virtual reality is already playing a bigger part in our lives, and mixed reality is going to become a much bigger thing in the future than it is today. In addition to that, you have 3D printing, and outside of 3D printing, even if you don't like that, if you're not a hobbyist, you don't want to build something like that, at some point in your life, you're going to want something that's different than what happens to be on the market, and you don't have to print it at home. In reality, you're not going to probably spend the money you would need to spend on an amazing 3D printing machine to build something at home. But there's another trend that's happening, which is advanced manufacturing. It's basically the democratization of manufacturing. So in other words, what I'm trying to say, in the most long-winded way possible, apparently, is that there are economic drivers right now that are they're exposing people to more and more and more 3D, and will be in the near future. The big problem has been that understanding 3D has been challenging, right? If you ever worked in CAD, or you've ever worked with any 3D program, you'll understand what I mean. It's not very intuitive. The model doesn't behave the way that you would think at first glance. You have to really learn it. Every system's a little bit different. Most of these programs look like they were built in 1972, whether they're all gray boxes and tons of buttons. They're not easy to use. They're not user friendly, and so most people are afraid of touching it. They think it's very complicated. There aren't simple ways of interacting. So what we're trying to do at FISNA is bridge that gap by simplifying it. And the way that we simplify it is, give them a great view, let them see the model, let them understand the data behind the model without having to manually go in and get it. So one thing we do is we automate the analysis. So instead of, if you're a CAD engineer and you want to know the hole diameter on something, you might open up the file, you figure out how to rotate it specifically, you figure out what the hole's supposed to be, you go and you measure it manually with a mouse. That's a nightmare for someone who's not a CAD engineer. So what we do is we automate that. And if you want to find the hole diameter, we say, fine, here, look it up. What hole diameter do you want? Anyone? Click on it. Click on a hole. Right? We'll highlight the hole for you. And then it will tell you what the diameter is. We'll tell you what all the diameters are. We'll tell you what all these parts are. You can take a picture to find a 3D model. You can describe it without knowing the part number to find a 3D model. One big problem out in the industry right now is that if you go to a website like Thingiverse or GrabCAD or anything like that, where you're trying to find a 3D model for consumer use as maybe a 3D printer enthusiast or whatever you are, it's try finding something very specific, right? If you type in rabbit, you'll find 5,000 rabbits, right? If you type in like ice cube maker, you'll find 1,000 ice cube makers. So it's really hard to narrow down what you're looking for. And by the way, for the 1,000 that you found, there are probably 70,000 that you didn't find because they were in different languages or called something different. So we're bridging that gap by simplifying the process. And with FISNA, actually, the majority of our users now are non-engineers, the people in supply chain, people in maintenance, people who've never had access to a 3D model before, but now it's really simple for them. So only about a tenth of the users that we're experiencing are actually professional 3D engineers.
Okay, and so and you mentioned, when we started speaking in terms of the non-engineering aspects and sort of your desire to talk about that is very, very clear. And so what I'm quite keen to know is, for you going forward, what is the thing that excites you the most? What are you looking forward to being able to provide people the most? Just for, not in terms of the business, but for you personally, what's the thing that really gets you excited specifically?
What gets me excited is so there's different types of companies, right? You have startups that or companies in general that I would say there's three types. There's companies that have a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. They typically don't do well. Then you've got companies that have a solution to a problem, and those are simple. And then you have companies, rarely, but occasionally, you have companies that have a solution to multiple problems. And and those are hard to run because you have to order. You can't go after every opportunity, and you have to figure out the sequencing, and you don't want to narrow it in too much, but at the same time, you can't be too broad. So, and that's really where we fit. What excites me about what we're doing is that in that third category, you have this opportunity to not be just an app or not be a specific one single product, but to actually enable an entire field, an entire category of technology. And in my mind, and I very strongly believe this, and a lot of research backs this up, that the next giant leap in technology is not going to be some new device, and it's not going to be some new app. It's going to be merging digital and physical technology, right? The merger of the digital and the physical world is amazing. And to put into perspective, if you take a really high resolution 2D picture of something, right? Even if it's extremely heavy, 50 megabytes or whatever, right? That 2D picture contains less than 1/10,000th the data and value that a simple 3D model of that same thing would contain, even if it's only a 100th of that weight. So there's so much more data you can get out of 3D, and we barely scratch the surface in understanding that. So for me, enabling that is amazing. And what I'm really looking forward to in the future is seeing how people use that core technology to open up other applications. There are applications that we don't have the ability to build in-house right now. We don't have the ability to build 500 products. So things like, being able to recognize tumors at an earlier stage than is possible with 2D AI. With 3D AI, you could do it much more efficiently, much earlier. But so if we can give other companies the technology, through an API or what have you, to enable that excites me. And just seeing people interact with a more, I guess I would describe it like this. The world around us is a combination of natural patterns and human-made patterns. Right now, you and I are conversing in a human-made pattern called English, right? This is our pattern, right? This is how we understand. I can get my thoughts from my brain into your brain, right? But then there are natural patterns everywhere too. Fibonacci sequences, for example, right? That kind of govern them. If you can start to merge the two, you get into an area of technology that's almost kind of like matrixy in a way. And what it does is democratizes creativity. And I think that people have so much more value that they can unleash than they realize. And what makes us human is our creative ability. And if everybody had the ability on a whim to design something for interaction either in a digital or the physical world without having to go through years of training on how to use some stupid software program and how to do it. That would fundamentally change how not only how we perceive the world around us, but how the world around us would look and feel. We would
Absolutely,
have
yeah.
innovation much faster than we do now.
Yeah. That's so really interesting. And for anyone who exhibits the kind of hunger and drive that you have, where, I could ask you a very cliche question, where did that come from? But what I'd find more interesting is actually when you were younger and you first, what you called is, had that sort of first realization that you wanted to leave a footprint. Who did you look up to in terms of leaders, in terms of inspiring figures, in terms of someone else going, that's how you leave a footprint and I want to do something similar? What did that look like to you when you were younger?
To me, it looked like back when the History Channel had history on it. I used to watch the documentaries all the time. I loved it, and I looked at people like Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, and you look at not only what they did, but the consequences of it, right? Like
Mm,
if you go from one person like Galileo or so, whatever, and you go forward through the generations, you're like, oh my God, that one person had, had unimaginable impact on the future. They didn't necessarily live to see all of it, but they really
sure.
unleashed a whole new. They innovated in a way that didn't create a thing. They created a way that They innovated in a way that allowed other people to innovate better and faster. It's
Mm,
basically it's a multiplying exponential effect that they had on human development, and that to me was just like the ultimate. This is the ultimate thing to accomplish with your life. And I'm like, I got one chance to live my life. I don't want to just consume. I get to live a really comfortable life compared to people in the past and
mhm.
like medieval times and stuff because we have great technology now, and I'm not going to die from the first cold I get.
Yeah.
We're going to live longer, we live healthier, we live happier, and we do that because of technology. And I think it would be kind of selfish to just consume that, but not contribute back and give something back to the world. So the people I looked up to, I saw them. Maybe part of the nice thing here was that by being homeschooled and being largely self-taught, I wasn't around. I mean, I was around other kids, but not as much. And I think that there might have been a negative effect on that. Maybe that's why I talk a mile a minute and don't have any sense of brevity. But but um, but the positive effect on that for me was I got to think bigger picture, and I got to think about like how do I measure up to these historical figures versus how do I measure up to my classmates
Uh-huh.
and
Yeah.
my buddies, right? I
Mhm.
think that a lot of people get stuck in that peer-to-peer
Sure.
trap, and I think that I was able to kind of get out of that just because I didn't have the opportunity to think that way.
Okay. Yeah. And there's always that's those studies or that reference point of you are the sum of the 10 people you spend your time with. And actually exactly what you said, maybe you actually, the time you were spending with is some of these greats or some of these geniuses. And that's where you were almost the people you were connecting with on a daily basis through word or through paper or through online. That was the sum of that, rather than your peers at school, where I think you're right. People get trapped in, they think of the 10 people closest to them at school, and maybe they get stuck being, a choice of word, but whatever word you might use, you're right, it might affect someone's outcome in terms of where they might go. And following on from that particular point is, do you think it's easier or harder now to leave a footprint? Either way, it could be a lot easier in the sense that obviously there's so many more avenues and opportunities, and people today, we're starting further and further along than our predecessors started on, and some of the examples you gave. But maybe maybe because there is so much, it's harder to do so than it was for them. And I'm just curious, from your point of view, you want to leave a footprint. Do you think it's easier or harder to do now?
It's both. And what I mean by that is, so it's fairer in the sense that, if you go back far enough in history, the odds of you making it to be 5 years old are pretty low,
Yeah.
right? There was no written record. There's a lot of, you go far enough back and there's no real way to leave a meaningful impact, at least not a very long lasting one. But if you go to the modern age, I mean, think about it. Like the number of people who were alive, 1,000 years ago was a tiny fraction of the number of people we have alive today on Earth. And so in that sense, it's harder because there are more people. But on the other hand, everybody has all the tools they need. Even people who are living in poverty, maybe not, in extreme examples, but at least in the, more or less developed world, even people who were kind of in the poverty level, I certainly didn't grow up rich at all, but like, I think that they have more opportunity than they ever had in the past. It's more democratized in the sense because if you have access to the internet and you have a computer, you can change the world. Period.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't need to even buy it. You can go to a library and you have that tool
Yeah.
all of a sudden to change the world. So virtually everybody, has that opportunity now that they didn't have in the past. There are more people, but I think that I would say it's easier because if you really have that drive and you really have that ambition and you're really going to put in the effort to deserve to change the world,
Yeah.
then you absolutely have the ability to do so now. In the past, it would have been a lot easier to incidentally change the world than it would be today.
Yeah. Okay. So, and on that route of trying to change the world, no doubt you've obviously, like everyone else, had many a setback along the way.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious. It's always it's always a question you can ask someone who gets to any level, but it's always still interesting to know what the answers are. Which is, between those setbacks, we don't necessarily need to know what they are unless you want to share them. But actually, at what points and how did you find that courage and that strength and the conviction, aside from the hunger, that actually told you, well, despite everything that's in front of me, this is the right direction. People around me might still be telling me this isn't, I should be going this way instead with it now. But you, with your conviction, you thought, no, this is the way I wanted to take it. How did you continue with that conviction? It's always interesting to know people's perspective on that.
That's a really great question. I think that the answer honestly is the hunger. It's if you're obsessed enough about something, you become stubborn after a while. I mean, and if people say that's not going to work, it almost starts to fuel you. When people say that's a
Yeah.
dumb idea, it's never going to work. I'm like, okay, now it's on. Now I have to.
Yeah, it's good.
But in
Yeah.
a sense, one thing that this is almost hypocritical advice because I struggle with this still, but I'm definitely better than I was in the past. When something doesn't go my way, right, and I experience failure, and failure can be major, it can be minor, right? It
Mm-hmm.
can be a sales call not going the way you want it to, right?
Absolutely.
There are lots of you have many failures and successes throughout the day. Sure, failure can be disheartening, but I even say in retrospect, when I think about it from a macro picture, which I think is the most important thing to do, is keep things in macro perspective. If you stay in the macro, you won't go off track. So if I go, a couple people have asked me in the past, if you can go back in time and tell yourself 10 years ago, 5 years ago,
Yes,
whatever,
classic question.
something, what would you tell yourself? And other than joking about what stocks to invest in, like as far as like for my own life, the answer is that I frankly wouldn't. I wouldn't go back and tell myself anything. And that's because, yeah, there are things that mistakes that I've made. I've failed in many things. And the funny thing is, everybody talks about what they've succeeded in. No one talks about what they failed in. The only reason I'm not mentioning specifics is because there's so many things I failed in that it would be on here for 3 years, right? You fail a lot, but you fail up, right, in a
Yeah,
way.
sure.
And if I were to go back in time and tell my younger self, hey, don't do this, don't hire this person, don't go to this place, don't invest money in this area or whatever, I might have gotten away from those failure points, sure,
Mm.
but I would have had others, and I wouldn't have had the strength to, if I got to this point in my life and I never had those failures, I wouldn't have learned what I know now. I wouldn't have. I mean, there's some things that you can learn from hearing it from somebody else or by reading it, and you should always be in pursuit of that knowledge because that can save you a lot of trouble. But in some cases, you have to learn some skills the hard way, and I'm actually, honestly, and I don't mean this as a cliche, I'm actually thankful that things didn't go my
Mm.
way. In fact, I would say most of what attributed to the biggest successes in my life were failures in smaller pursuits. And it's made me
Okay.
rethink my life. I'm like, hey, if that smaller thing I was going after didn't work as
Sure.
well, why
Yeah.
don't I go to something bigger? Why do I have to think so small? Right?
Yeah. Well, very interesting to Well, I always love hearing that sort of stuff, and also I liked your the kind of the macro perspective thing. I think I think that really is spot on, because sometimes you get so caught up in the detail, don't you? You get caught up in the intricacies right in front of your face, and actually the you've got to do the work in terms of understanding strategy and implementation, where you take a step away, so and can take simpler and smaller actions after a setback. Now, speaking to you, anyone who is trying to create something or build something or set up their own business, they're very much either kind of the artist, as in the person, they love to do what they do, like they love the actual action, or they love the thing, or someone who's just great and really understands business. And you get, for example, you'll get the chef who loves cooking, and therefore they decide to set up their own restaurant, and then they realize, oh shit, this is actually, I've got to do 10 other things running a restaurant. And they realize that actually all they love to do is being the chef. It's not the management of the restaurant. To me, it sounds like, maybe at least at the beginning, maybe not still now, is that you were kind of the artist. You had this passion for this particular thing. And I always like to understand that transition, in terms of, like, you want to be an artist, but you also realize that to do what you want to do, it's going to require this new business, it's going to require this new venture or whatever, that you're going to have to upskill in all of these other areas as well. Maybe the things that you're not super passionate about, but you have to upskill in terms of sales and everything else, marketing, everything else. So what did that upskilling process look like for you, and how difficult was that as you went through it, when you realized, actually, I've now got to get good at this. I've now got to get good at this as well as my passion.
I think that the most important thing is to keep your passion, keep your fuel burning. If you have the right ambition, the skill sets come pretty naturally, and they can come the easy way by learning them. They can come the hard way by learning the hard way. Yeah, you're totally right. I am passionate about business in general, but what we're doing here, I'm very passionate about what we're doing at FISNA from a technical perspective and from a macro perspective. And it's not just the day in, day out of running a business. I love doing that. I do, but that's not the only thing that keeps me excited. It's the macro picture. So, but I'm still excited about what I do every day, because of the macro pictures. I don't separate between the two. I don't say, well, all I want to do is stay home and dream about how great it'll be when we've made all these changes and we've made all this money, and the world's totally better. No, because we're never going to get there that way. So I get excited about the minutia because I know that they add up to the macro.
Okay.
And I learn how to do the minutia because I know that if I don't learn how to do them, they won't add up to the macro. Right?
Yes.
For me, it's a necessity, but I don't lose passion. I can be very, very passionate about marketing or about sales or about or even HR matters, right? I can be very passionate about these things, not because I'm passionate about paperwork, but because I'm passionate about the effect that that's going to have on the macro picture.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, it's always that difference between, I always say to people or my clients that you don't get what you want, you get what you have to have. And sort of what you're saying there is that actually these things are, as you said, a necessity to what it is that you want, or that you feel you need to do. So I totally get that. The final thing I wanted to touch on or ask about is, you talked about wanting to leave a footprint. And, I guess a two-part question, which is, one, do you feel like at this point in time you have left a footprint? And the second part of that question is, can you leave a footprint for the people listening, in terms of, actually, from your experience and everything you've been through, that actually, if you could leave a footprint on these people, or footsteps for people to follow, what is it that you might say to them? So the first part of the question, and then the second part.
That's a really, really clever question. I like it a lot. Have I left a footprint yet? Do I feel like I've left one? Not completely. I feel like if I felt like I've already left the biggest footprint that I could leave, I would be done, right?
Yeah, true.
I'm always going to be trying to leave a bigger footprint. If I've left a little one already, that's cute. But honestly, I don't really spend much time thinking about where I am. I think more about where I need to go. So I don't really put a whole lot of mental energy into, is it a footprint? Does it just smell like a footprint? Is it a very tiny baby footprint? What is this thing, right? Have I left anything behind? I don't know. And I probably won't know. If I were to die now, I would die not knowing. And that might be the case later, but I'm going to really pursue a really big footprint, so that even if I don't notice that I left one behind at the time that I die, hopefully I will. I would like to think that I will. But at some point in history, that impact will be felt in a much larger way. And I realize that's what the point of it
Sure.
is. Right?
Yeah.
You don't always realize the impact of your work until after you die. So no, I think we've got a long way to go, and I don't feel satisfied. I'm very much still thirsty, as hungry as ever for what we're doing. To the second part of your question, if I could leave a footprint for someone, I would say probably if I had to narrow down I mean, I don't know, I've got a lot of opinions on things, but if I had to leave people with one bit of advice on something that I think is the most impactful and the most important thing to keep in mind, it would really just be this one simple thought, and that is that we're trained, unfortunately, and we have this natural tendency from evolution to think backwards. And that is, what paths do I have available? Which path do I want to go down? Okay, what's the next step? What's the next step? What's the next step?
Mm.
And it's very backwards. And you need to think about the goal first and work your way backwards to the plan. And if that sounds backwards, then let me just point out this. Yeah, that might sound backwards chronologically, but it's the right way to think. Because when you want to go somewhere, if you're traveling, right, and you ask for directions from your GPS or what have you, you don't say, what street looks the prettiest? Okay, I'm gonna go down that street. Oh, this street looks nice over there. I'm gonna go down that street. You'll never end up anywhere. You'll just go down a bunch of pretty streets and end up God knows where.
Mm-hmm.
But if you know where you're going, and so the directions that you take, you don't even really care. You're just like, oh, this is the best way to get here. You don't ask for people's opinions. You don't say, what do you think about this street? Are you proud of the street that I'm on? You don't care if you're not proud. You don't really care about the street that you're on, and you don't really worry about it. You're not like, oh, I don't really like the street. You don't care because you're so focused on where you're going, where you're actually headed, that the street is irrelevant. And so the right way to think is to start with a big picture. Start with a macro goal. What do you want out of life? Right? I think that's the most important question that no one's asking. Right? What if I get one shot, one very short, very important shot at life? Right? No matter what your religious beliefs, we all can agree at least that, as far as your current consciousness is aware, you have one shot at life.
Absolutely.
So what do you want out of it? If you're miserable, it's really an opportunity wasted. So if you're in pursuit of what you want, and you know that as it's crystal clear, it doesn't have to be business, it can be anything that's crystal clear to you, then obsession becomes a good thing. And everything that you go through in life will become much easier and and you'll have more energy, you'll feel better about things. Failures won't be a big deal, because if you're on your way to a store, for instance, and you know that's your destination, you're not really too bothered by a red light or a stop sign, because that's just part of going to the store. You're not upset. You don't say, oh, stop sign, oh, I'm going home. But you don't do that, right? So because you're so focused on the destination. And so if you can live your life like that, if you can apply the same amount of wisdom to your life that you apply to going to the grocery store, you'll live a much happier life and you'll be far more successful, because you will end up going in the right direction. And little failures along the way won't bother you so much. And I think that's the best advice I can give, if it's worth anything.
I think that's a wonderful analogy, and what I've really appreciated actually on this conversation, Paul, is that I just think, even just the word obsession for so many people, or I'd even put it, not so many people, too many people, seems to have this negative connotation, which for the people who actually finds that obsession but is having such a positive impact on people, obsession can be an incredible thing. And it's actually as you sort of said a few times, it's sort of what is required. Because otherwise, if you don't have that thing that's a burning passion and desire to get obsessed about, I say to a lot of people, I did an interview not so long ago, what would you say to people who want to get into business? I said, don't. And I said, don't, because unless you have that thing, it just, all the directions, all the failures you're speaking about, it just won't go. It just won't. And so I love your analogy at the end. And all I can say to you, Paul, is firstly, I really appreciate your time. And secondly, that, I wish you all the best going forward in what is is an unbelievable pursuit, really. And it's a pleasure to have done done some research beforehand and to have been introduced to you by a mutual party. But to hear even more of your story and the work you're doing is very inspiring for me and for the people listening. So, Paul, I really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me, and best to you too.
Thank you.